Beijing has set its economic agenda for 2026 to 2030 with its new 15th five-year plan. What will the next 5 years look like for China in terms of AI, in terms of development and common prosperity? And how are Chinese citizens directly involved in the process? We'll discuss this and more on this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report. Every week, we'll be helping you sort through all of the propaganda with an independent view of the country that we're taught to hate, but know so little about. I'm your host, Amanda Yee. These are this week's headlines. The U.S. and China have reached a framework agreement on trade, averting a 155% tariff that President Trump had threatened in response to Beijing's new rare earths export controls. Negotiators reached the agreement shortly after Trump landed in Kuala Lumpur Sunday and discussed U.S. special port charges on Chinese-built ships, a further extension of a trade truce, fentanyl tariffs, and cooperation on combating illegal drugs, as well as export controls. This paves the way for a potential trade agreement for Trump's scheduled meeting with President Xi Jinping on Thursday, October 30th, in Busan, South Korea. The two leaders have not met in person since 2019 at the G20 summit in Japan. U.S. threats won't stop China's growing relations with Central America. That's what Beijing said in response to the State Department's announcement of visa restrictions on Central American citizens for their supposed links to the Communist Party of China. In a press conference last Tuesday, Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson Guo Jiakun told reporters that no amount of weaponization of visas or other threats can hold back China's flourishing ties with the region, and that the U.S. should give up its bullying and domineering act. In September, the State Department announced visa restrictions on Central American nationals, quote, intentionally acting on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party, knowingly direct, authorize, fund, provide significant support to, or carry out activities that undermine the rule of law in Central America, unquote. The U.S. has increased its targeting of Latin American and Caribbean countries and the relationship with China recently in what is widely assumed as its attempts to reassert its belief of the region being its so-called backyard. Guo's reaction was a response to the increasing attempts by the U.S. to dismantle or sabotage its growing political and economic relations with the region. China has claimed that the U.S. has been carrying out cyber attacks and digital surveillance in Latin American and Caribbean countries, targeting Chinese interests in its effort to pressure the governments to break or limit their ties with Beijing. Rejecting attempts to divide China and Latin America, Guo asserted, quote, China will continue to be the good friend and good partner of Central American countries in the common pursuit of development and vitalization and in building a China, Latin American, Caribbean community with a shared future, end quote. China may soon break its own record for the world's fastest commercial train. During a recent test, the CR450 achieved speeds of 450 kilometers or 281 miles an hour, surpassing the current record of 217 miles per hour achieved by China's CR400 Fuxing trains. The CR450 will operate on the Shanghai-Chongqing-Chengdu high-speed railway and is expected to begin commercial service as early as next year. Engineers focused on equipping the CR450 with structural enhancements designed to reduce drag to achieve the bullet train's speed. These enhancements include increasing its nose cone from 41 feet on the current Fuxing train models to 49 feet and reducing height and trimming weight by 55 tons. Now in its final testing stage, the bullet train has to achieve 373,000 miles of trial runs before being cleared for commercial services. China plans to increase average life expectancy to 80 years of age over the next 5 years. That's according to Health Minister Lei Haichao at a press conference on Friday. To reach this objective, Lei emphasized the importance of a health-centered approach that focuses on disease prevention. Specific measures including raising public health awareness and strengthening the management of key risk factors such as weight and blood pressure. Lei added that national efforts will be intensified to address major chronic diseases, including cardiovascular conditions, cancer, chronic respiratory diseases, and diabetes. He also called for making healthcare services more convenient and efficient for the public, strengthening hospital collaboration, and improving primary healthcare services. China's average life expectancy reached 79 years of age at the end of 2024. Last week in Beijing, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China concluded its fourth plenary session with the adoption of recommendations for the country's 15th five-year plan. What are some of the key priorities that will steer China's economy and development over the next 5 years? And how are the Chinese people directly involved in setting this economic agenda? To discuss this, we are so honored to have on Dr. Yan Liang. Yan is an endowed chair and professor of economics at Willamette University, a research associate at the Levy Economics Institute, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University. Yan, welcome to the China Report.
Well, thank you for having me, Amanda. It's an honor to be here with you.
Well, it's an honor to be here with you. Maybe to get started, it's undeniable that China has experienced a really rapid modernization over the last 3-4 decades. Maybe before we talk about the specifics of the 15th five-year plan, could you tell us the role of five-year plans in China's governance and how they've guided China's development over the last few decades?
Yeah, great question. I think, the context is very important. As you know, this five-year plan, the one that was just announced as a communique, right, is the 15th one. So by the calculation, you know that China started to do this kind of exercise since the early 60s. So this has been an ongoing and consistent, a long-term oriented kind of socialist planning for the economy. As we know, China's economy is socialism, market economy. So the central planning, the socialist planning is a ingrained, deep-rooted part of the system. Unlike in the West, a lot of times the policymakers cannot look beyond a political cycle that usually is 4 years. In China, the idea is that we wanted to map out the long-term trajectory of the economic development. So all of this leads to say that every 5 years, they made this five-year plan that towards, some sort of even longer term goal. So to understand this, this current one is really the one that we go towards by, 2035. China wants to bring moderately modern, sort of income level to its people, right? So it wants to really get into that high income level kind of country rank. And then going forward, they're going to continue to build the economy to have the modern socialist economy, by 2050. So all of these are just really long-term goals. And so to be able to achieve this goal, then, every year they set this five-year plan that would provide some policy guidance, that specific policies will be then crafted and passed by the NPC, the National People's Congress, with a consultation with other, parties. That usually happens in 2020 in the spring, right, of the following year. So this is how the process goes, again, with the long-term goal and with some concrete policies with the broad input from the economy and society.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the key priorities of the 15th five-year plan? What are some of the key drivers that are going to steer the Chinese economy from 2026 to 2030? And how do you see this plan move China toward its goal of, what they call basically achieving socialist modernization by 2035, as you said?
Right. So I think, first of all, what you see is very consistent policy messages, I would say, from the 14th five-year plan. So on the top is that, again, China is cultivating the so-called high-quality productive forces in the sense that it wants to continue to promote productivity growth through scientific and technological innovations. And it wants to also utilize the kinds of technological innovations to integrate them, right, into the more traditional industries. In fact, this is actually the number one priority in this communicate, right, is that China wants to upgrade its traditional industries with all these technological breakthroughs. And second, I think, the government has been talking about boosting domestic demand. Again, this idea of dual circulation model, that there is a domestic demand that China is going to utilize to, push its demand side up. At the same time, utilizing international circulation, right, continue to have high quality opening. So those two, right, are symbiotic. They're going to together provide the demand side impetus for China's growth. And then in this communique, what I noticed also is, of course, China is going to continue with decarbonization, right, with green transformation, green transition, because this is not only good for China's long-term sustainable growth, but it is also as a way for China to develop its technologies. As we know that China is now leading in many of these green energies, green tech, green products. And I think China would want to double down on a lot of these environmental sustainability initiatives, especially, as you probably know, and, China has already enshrined the so-called ecological civilization in its 2018 constitution. So the kinds of green development, again, it's going to be that long-term trajectory. And I think another thing that is important in this communique is also the idea of investing in the people. So that means providing, more solid social safety net, welfare programs. And I think that is not only important to promote the service consumption directly, right, by providing and really nurture a lot of these very essential service sectors, but also really to kind of reduce the anxieties of people, right? Reduce the cautionary kind of savings. So I think this is really, sort of one stone hits two birds, right? Kind of policy that would not only directly boost people's living standards, but also help to expand domestic demand, especially in the service, which still has a lot of room to grow. And then last but not the least, of course, China, as I mentioned earlier, right, this double dual circulation approach is to continue to promote high quality opening, to really kind of, as Xi Jinping always talked about, to develop this sort of shared prosperity, especially with the global South.
Mm. You mentioned this a few minutes ago, but when reading about the 15th five-year plan, I noticed that there's a major prioritization on what they call new quality productive forces. New quality productive forces that move China up the manufacturing value chain as the primary means of achieving economic growth, and to achieve self-reliance. So can you talk a little bit more about, what new quality productive forces means, and why is there so much emphasis placed on this, and where does the role of AI, where is it in that discussion?
Right. Yeah, I think that's the key, right? To really understand China's technological sort of commitment, right? The innovations and how it really sees itself to promote the so-called high quality development. So the high quality development was actually brought up already back in 2017. And the term high quality productive forces was introduced by Xi Jinping in 2023. And then, it's seen as a way to achieve the high quality development. So why high quality development, right? So the idea is that China's growth model in the past 4 decades have been resource intensive, and it has led to the advancements of some people, some regions, right? But that model seemed to be already out of sync, right, with China's reality today. So the idea is that we need to have a new way of development, and that development needs to be more sustainable, needs to be productively driven, and needs to be inclusive. And so how to achieve that kinds of development is where these high quality productive forces would need to be nurtured and need to be solidified and need to be developed. And so the idea here is that development or the productive force need to come with scientific innovations and technological innovations. And the kinds of innovations need to be integrated into or applied to the traditional sectors. So then you'll be able to boost the so-called total factor productivity, right? The TPF, which is basically a broad base, right? Improvements in productivity. So the whole idea of high quality productive force or productive force itself is a Marxian term, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's describe the productive capacity, right? The human capability to use productive resources like machines, tools, natural resources, you name it, right? To be able to promote the kind of productivity growth and to be able to drive more sustainable growth going forward. And again, I think the inclusiveness part of this is also important. The idea is that, the traditional sector still account for about 80% of China's GDP, right? The new emerging advanced manufacturing sector now is about 18 to 20% of the economy. So the idea is that we cannot just have those emerging frontier technological sectors. We need to apply those sectors and upgrade the traditional sectors. So you can have the broad-based improvements of the economy, create, better jobs, higher income. And so that could create a virtuous cycle, right, where technological growth is going to promote economic, productivity growth, and that translates to more jobs, higher income, which then translate into higher consumption to absorb the higher, production levels. And you can see, right, how this could create a virtuous cycle to push the economy forward. So yes, the high quality productive force is really the key that works both from the supply side and I would argue the demand side, which I think a lot of Western narrative, right, fails to recognize that the way that China wants to promote more domestic consumption, it's part of, this whole end game, right, of promoting the supply side and productivity growth.
Mm. I think critics might point to slowing growth in the Chinese economy. They might point to its property sector facing a slump, youth unemployment at an all-time high, a rapidly aging population as, particular challenges that China might need to confront over the next 5 years. How do you expect China to confront these challenges? And what do you predict?
Right. Well, I think, first of all, we know that China had breakneck growth, right, in the past 4 decades. Average rate growth was about 9%, if not double digits, depending when you count. But it's clear that right now, the economic size of China, right, this year is projected to, reach about $19 trillion worth of GDP. Given that economic size, and given that I will talk about this, that China's pivot, right? It is not in China's interest to continue grow at that, 9-10% average growth rate year after year. So this 5% growth rate is really towards the goal of materializing the moderately, prosperous economy by 2035. This is the goal China set for itself in 2020, right? Double the per capita GDP. And so that means the annual growth rate needs to be about 5%, right? From 2020 to 2035. So that is the goal that China tries to achieve, right? Not to continue to grow at 9-10%, but 5% is about right to reach that long-term goal. And second, I think all the challenges that you mentioned needs to be contextualized in China's pivot toward this high quality growth, right? China is no longer interested in the high speed growth. It wants to improve the quality of its growth. And so you need to understand that kind of pivot to really understand why China start to, readjust its property sector, right? And why China wants to promote certain public investment and private initiatives towards the technologies that would deliver the kind of high quality development goal. So the number of things that you talked about, right? The property sector, yes, I would say that is a very deliberate policy. I wrote about, this property sector corrections, and I like to call it a control the demolition, right? Because we know that since the global financial crisis in 2008, China has spent a lot of efforts to boost its domestic demand. And so private sector since that time have seen really rapid growth, but come with certain consequences, right? The positive aspect is that China has one of the highest housing ownership in the world among, some of the former socialist economies. So China is able to provide affordable housing to many of its citizens. But the housing prices have been going up, especially after, the 2008 financial crisis, with a lot of financial resources, a lot of investments going into the real estate sector. So that's when Beijing decided in 2020 that this is not a desirable model, that the real estate sector is consuming too much resources in the economy and is not really providing the kinds of productivity growth that, the government wants to see. And therefore, with the 3 red line policies constraining the real estate sector, making the sector to deleverage and so on and so forth, that is what I think, caused this slowdown in that sector. And I think, in the long term, this is in China's interest, right, to curb the speculation in the real estate sector and really divert the resources to some other more productive sector. So yes, those are challenges. But I think China is managing, right? We have seen a slew of policies since September last year that have been rolled out to try to provide some stabilization in the real estate market. So I think these are likely to be relatively short-term challenges. And I think as China continue to, divert resources to the more productive sectors, I think we're likely to see that being stabilized. Now, that being said, the property sector is very important for local government tax revenues, and also for households' wealth effect. So I do think the government can do more to stabilize the sectors. I would even argue that the central government need to set up some kinds of housing funds to allow the local governments to buy up some of these houses for social housing, and also make sure that some of these projects that are started would need to be completed. Now, moving on to the AI sector and other frontier emerging sectors, I think the government is doubling down right on these efforts for 2 reasons. One is to achieve technological self-reliance, as China sees this is not only about its economic development interests, but also about national security, about economic sovereignty. And second is, I mentioned earlier, right? These technologies are essential because they are general purpose technologies, very much like the ICT, transformation. And I see that China sees these as really the impetus, right, and the driving force for technological innovations and upgrading its traditional industries.
I see. Well, what we do on the show primarily is we try to challenge these U.S. propaganda narratives around China, and we try to, inform people about, how the Chinese government really works. So, we get this narrative that the government is authoritarian, how it doesn't respond to the people. So I think people would be really curious to know, how do government officials come up with and set the key priorities for each 5-year plan? How does it end up making it into this plan? And how do they set the economic agenda for 1.4 billion people? Like, are the Chinese citizens directly involved in drafting this?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And kudos to all the work that you are doing and your team, right? Really to debunk some of these myths, some of these propaganda, as you said. Well, I think some of the scholars would describe China's system, as economic democracy, right? As a whole process democracy, in the sense, yes, the economic resources are utilized in such a way that would meet the public causes, that would meet the public needs, right? In the Western economy, I would say a lot of times what we have is a so-called performative democracy, right? That people can vote for every 4 years. But nothing really changed when it comes to, defending for mostly the corporate interests, the financial interests of the elites. But in China, right, as people often said, even though it is sort of so-called one-party system, but parties' policies always change to meet the evolving needs of the people. So I wanted to address the question that you asked in maybe one very general terms, but then also give some specific examples. So in general terms, yes, people are participating in crafting policies. So the 5-year plan, for example, it is crafted by the Communist Party of China's Central Committee, which have 250 members and some of the alternate members that are participating in the direct crafting of this exercise, right, in this 5-year plan. But they have been doing really thorough work. So before they start any sort of the new 5-year plan, they usually would start with a midterm evaluation of the current 5-year plan, right? How well they do, what targets they meet, what targets are on track, and so on and so forth. And that kinds of insights will go into the crafting of the next 5-year plan. So once they draft this plan, they would open it up for public discussion. Now, arguably, this process was still pretty new. It started really just last year. But they do have a public comment period that lasts for a month, right after they finish the drafting. In I believe it's May this year in 2025, they opened it up for public comments until June 2025, and then they revise and until they announce the communique in October this year. So there is public participation in the process, and this year they actually got I believe 3 million public comments, right, that they work. And Xi Jinping actually openly stated that this process needs to take into account more of these kinds of public opinions in one of the meetings. And as you know, once the 5-year plan is announced, then the next step is really to craft concrete policies, right, that would deliver this goals. And so that would happen at the National People's Congress, which usually have 3,000 right participants, and that include the political consulting body. That basically have many different parties, right, input in that process. And again, these thousands of all these People's Congress representatives, they're really elected right around the country, right, all over the country, from some of the very grassroots, start from the very grassroots levels. So it is very much a whole purpose kind of whole process kind of democracy. And also, I think, within the department, within the party's leadership circle, many of these government officials, they are merit-based career officials, even though they're also party members, right? They are evaluated based on their work performances. And as you probably also know, that in fact, there's a recent book that wrote about, it's called a breakneck growth, right, about China, and says basically China is run by engineers, right? Which is not an overstatement. When you look at the government officials' credentials, a lot of them come from engineering, science, industrial backgrounds. So they really see, right, the needs of the people. They're able to have the technocratic, expertise to craft policies, right, that will address people's needs and really move China forward in that, development process. And then I want to just very quickly on, the examples, right? As I mentioned earlier, the way that China move towards the more green development is precisely a response to people's needs. As China grew, right, in the period from 2000 to, I would say, around 2010s, the very fast-paced growth has created a lot of environmental damages. And so you've seen, some public, protest. You see people's really visible kinds of advocates, right, for better environment, more sustainable, living space, and so on and so forth. And that really prompt the government to take various actions from both top down, but also bottom up, I think, processes to address these kinds of environmental challenges. And that's why you see China really is determined, right, to achieve the double carbon goals by 2030, carbon peak, 2060 carbon neutrality, and really double down on green investments, right? Invest more than the rest of the world combined in renewable energies, energy storage, and so on and so forth. So I think that is a very salient example that China's policymakers are really paying attention, right, to what the people want and also what the economy needs in a more sustainable, long-term oriented way.
Mm. I really like what you said about the United States being a performative democracy. I think that's really spot on because, as you mentioned, what is a democracy if like a party gets into power and then they pass all of these policies only to have an election every 2 to 4 years for another party to get into power and just completely undo everything that they passed. And I think, it's very evident right now during the Trump administration where they're like very rapidly chipping away at all of the rights, what little democracy we had, and the gains that we gained during the civil rights period. And I also think, a lot of the economic agenda here in the United States is, just driven by trying to chase higher and higher profits. And relatedly, I wanted to ask you a question about China's state-owned enterprises. Because I think this is, one of the institutions that guide this kind of long-term strategic vision that China sets. So can you talk about the differences and priorities and results that you've seen from the U.S. and China models, and also the strategic role that state-owned enterprises play in steering the Chinese economy toward achieving these strategic goals?
Right. I really think the unique advantage, right, and the very interesting model that China is having right now, right, is really this sort of hybrid model. I know there are people call China's model as state capitalism. There are others call it, socialist market economy and many other different labels, right? But I think what China really demonstrates is this very effective, very synergized kind of hybrid model where you have 60% of the economic output, right, is accounted for by private enterprises, 20% by state enterprises, and another about 20% by foreign investing enterprises. And these three components, they seem to be excel in different areas. So the SOEs, the state enterprises, they're really occupying a very important space in some of the fundamental, sectors. Talk about utilities, talk about telecommunications, talking about financial sectors. In all these areas, you see the state enterprises play a very fundamental and very vital role. And why is that the case? Well, it's because when you think about utility, right, power generation, when you think about telecommunication, right, the 5G network, think about financial resources, that is really the lifeblood, right, of the entire economy. Those are really fundamental sectors that should not be oriented towards profit seeking, profit maximizing, this kinds of short-term goals, right? The strategy needs to be long-term. And also a lot of times when you're not for profit, right, you're not really thinking about how you can charge the highest amount of price and constrain the supplies so we can maximize the profits. And I think this is very essential. So for a lot of Western critiques and say China needs to have the SOE reforms, meaning privatization, of course, right? It's really missing the point, right? Because these enterprises are not meant for profit maximization. So when you're using profitability, all of these very narrow matrix, right, to evaluate whether or not these OEs are functional, I think that is a pure mistake. Right? They're not there to charge hard price, to monopolize the services and provide the least amount of, quantity in order to maximize profit. They're to ensure the economy is functioning in a smooth and effective way, right? And to achieve some of the long-term, objectives. So that's why I think it's important to have these OEs to lay the fundamental foundations of the economy so then the private sectors will be able to compete, right, and to be able to innovate and to be able to really deliver some other, essential goods and services for the economy. So right now, with a lot of utility companies are they own, for example, the China grid, right, the state grid. They're able to generate reliable, renewable energies for the rest of the economy. China's electricity price is 1/3 of the United States, and as you can see how important that is, right, to power AI revolution, for example, right, because AI is a big energy sucking industry. You need to ensure this kinds of long-term, reliable, cost-effective, energy, right, to power that sector and, of course, the broad economy. And finance is another very important example, right? In the Western world, you have all these big, gigantic financial corporations. They are pursuing profit maximizing objectives, and you can see how they can wreak havoc, right, the economy when they do so much financial engineering, when they basically use finance just for its own sake instead of to power and finance the real productive economies. And China is the opposite. The state-owned enterprises, the state-owned commercial banks, and policy development banks are really directing the financial resources to the productive economy. And that's why you see, right, once the real estate sector is cracked down, a lot of financial resources, the lending, the bank lending goes immediately into the industrial sector. So you can see the kinds of, the support, right, from the financial sector to these strategic goals. And so I think that is really why China's model is so successful, is because it's able to, use its resources, right, including the public investments as well as all these state-owned enterprises to move resources, to mobilize resources toward its long-term strategic goals, as opposed to, right, really focusing on the short-term, quarterly basis, your returns on your stock portfolio, and so on and so forth.
Mm. As an economist, I wanted to get your take on the U.S. China trade war. It was announced early this morning that the U.S. and China had agreed to a preliminary agreement or a stalemate in the trade war, but undoubtedly it will escalate again. So I guess, how can China balance growth and development while facing these kinds of global challenges, this kind of unpredictability as represented by Trump, as represented by this ongoing trade war?
Right. So I think, first of all, I think China sees this trade war as a much more fundamental and structural than a contemporary issue, right? It's not because of Trump per se. Trump will come and go, and the intensity of trade war and tech war can also go up and down. But I think from China's perspective, right, this is basically a transition of the world economy from a U.S. dominant, a hegemon sort of based economy to a more multipolar economy, a global, landscape, right? In that process, I think you will see tensions ratcheting up, but essentially, from China's point of view, this is the direction. That's the big direction where the world is moving on, right, from the U.S. center, order to a more multipolar order. So the way China sees it, right, this is a long-term historical trend, and so China needs to safeguard its own interests and prepare for the kinds of a transition. So what I would say China has been doing, right, since the early 2010s is to really improve its technological self-reliance. Now, it's not necessary that China sees the hostility from the United States or all these, tech ban, right, way ahead of time. Maybe they see that coming, but at the same time, they also see this as an economic priority, right? It's back in Premier Wen Jiabao, who already said, China had to export 800 million T-shirts to import one Airbus plane, right? So clearly, he and other policymakers back then already saw the problem that China is somehow stuck in that low value added global supply chain, and things need to be changed. So I think that's why China has been trying to improve its technological self-reliance to be able to climb up the global value chain. And so I think also that is what, really unnerved the United States, as J.D. Vance clearly put it, right? How dare China climb up the global value chain instead of, occupying that low value added space, which is, assigned, right, to countries from the global south, right? So I think China sees in its strategic interest, both for national security reasons, but also for its long-term economic development reasons, that it needs to double down on its technological breakthroughs. So I think that is one way China is, trying to prepare for the kinds of trade war or tech war or potentially, other areas of war, like financial war, for instance, right? And then the other possibility or other measure China is doing, of course, is trying to develop its own domestic market and trying to work with other more like-minded countries that try to safeguard the multilateral trading and investment system in the world. So as you know that, China has been trying to bolster its domestic consumption and investment, right, to have more demand-driven economy from within, right, because it's a large economy. It does have, 1.4 billion people. It does have, over 300 million, 400 million, middle class, and that number is, of course, growing. So it can, right, get a lot of these demand from internal sources. But at the same time, China does see, opening up and working with global south or some other Western economies, right, European economies, for instance, that these kinds of global, system is desirable for both China and other countries, right? China does believe in mutual benefits, win-win cooperation. So I think that is the strategy that China is employing right now, right? Domestically, it tries to boost its technological capacity. It tries to develop its own demand, but then externally, right, it is also pushing for outward investments. It's trying to work with other countries at both regional level, but also, to the broader global south, and also trying to cooperate with EU, right, despite some of the, deep distrust coming from the European Western advanced economies. So I think those are really the strategies China is employing. And again, that is not only just for Trump's trade war, but really much beyond that to prepare China, right, and prepare other countries as well to transition to that more multipolar system.
Well, Dr. Yan Liang, thank you so much for joining us this week on the China Report. Maybe for people who aren't familiar with your work, are you working on anything, or like where can people follow you if they're interested?
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity. So I worked mostly, on, of course, China's own economic development, especially from a development finance perspective, right? How does China mobilize financial resources? How does China support all these strategic initiatives domestically? But I'm also working on, China's role in reforming, right, the so-called global financial architecture through its BRI, through its RMB internationalization, and through its own, voice in several multilateral platforms, and so on and so forth. So my work can be found, in Levy working papers, also the Boston University's Global Development Policy Center that I co-author with other, scholars, and also having some working papers. I'm also active on LinkedIn, also on X. Sometimes I would engage in some of the brief exchanges with, other commentators, right, China watchers. So those are the places where I think you can find some of my work. I'm also, sort of media friendly. I do some CGTN interviews at times. So YouTube, you can also find some of my other podcasts with other, outlets. So again, it was a great pleasure to join you. I know we have a lot to unpack, and I tend to speak fast. So hopefully I'll have the opportunity to, speak with you on other maybe related matters in the near future. And again, I really enjoy your show. I really wanted to congratulate you and your colleagues in really promoting, fair and balanced, right, understanding of China and China's relationships with the rest of the world.
Well, the pleasure was all ours. Thank you, Yan.
Yeah, thank you.
Late October to early November is the rice harvesting season in the city of Hangzhou, and this video perfectly encapsulates China's rapid modernization. Located right next to Hangzhou's business and financial hub, locals have nicknamed this 740-acre stretch of farmland the Rice Field Central Business District. And it's not uncommon to see combines harvesting crops while high-speed trains rush past the city's skyscrapers in the background. When this video first went viral, Chinese netizens mused that scenes like these fulfill past fantasies of future cities. Before we go, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you like this episode, and I'll see you next week on the China Report.